Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Angela Starren, Senior Director of Advancement at the Lincoln Presidential Foundation, and I'm so glad you could join us for today's latest generation film contest mentor session. Script, storyboard, screen, make your ideas come to life. We are thrilled to be joined today by award-winning filmmaker Patrick Wimp. And at the Lincoln Presidential Foundation, our mission is to share the story of Abraham Lincoln's life, legacy, and leadership with all people. The latest generation film contest takes its name from a powerful question Lincoln asked an Indianapolis crowd in 1861. Shall the Union and shall the liberties of this country be preserved to the next generation? This year's theme, Think Anew, Act Anew, is inspired by Lincoln's 1862 annual message to Congress, where he said, "As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew." This theme encourages projects that explore people, communities, or movements in the United States that met generational challenges with creativity, innovation, and bold action. Now, in its second year, the contest is open to participants across the United States ages 14 to 22. Submissions are due February 28th, 2026, and cash prizes from $500 to $2,000 will be awarded in 3 age categories. Winning films will premiere at a red carpet event in Chicago in spring 2026. These mentor sessions are open to everyone and are designed to help you understand how filmmakers bring accurate and compelling stories to life. This program is offered in partnership with the Better Angel Society with generous support from its Amy Marjorie Education Fund. And we are so excited to have Patrick Wimp with us today. Before we begin, a quick note, your cameras will be off, but please feel free to submit your questions anytime using the Q&A box below. We'll answer as many as time allows toward the end of the session. Okay, so to start things off, we want to get a sense of your perspective on the filmmaking process. And I'm going to launch this poll. Okay, there you go. So please answer really quickly. How confident are you about your ability to turn your ideas into a documentary film? Okay, people are jumping in. That's great. Okay. All right. It looks like a mix. Um, it looks like we have a range of experience levels, and Patrick has some insights that'll be valuable to everyone, no matter where you are on your filmmaking path. And yeah, now it's my pleasure to introduce Patrick Wimp. Patrick is an award-winning biracial Black American screenwriter, director, and producer from Chicago. He's a mentor of the Writers Guild of America, and his films have been recognized at festivals including Chicago International, Cannes Film, Cannes International, New York Television Festival, Austin Festival, Series Fest, and HBO's Urbanworld. He wrote and directed Brothers from the Suburbs, which sold to Warner Brothers TV and HBO Max, and recently directed the Emmy-nominated documentary Mr. Abbott, which aired on AMC Plus in 2025. He's also worked as a cinematographer for Jennifer Hudson, Billie Eilish, and Chance the Rapper, and currently serves as an associate professor at the University of Iowa. Patrick, we're so excited to have you today. Take it away.
All right. Hello. Thank you very much, Angela. And I am very excited to be here. Very excited to, talk to the invisible faces that are out there in the world and in the Zoom. And hopefully, share some insights that will, I'm looking at this poll over here on the right of my screen. Most of us seem to live in the somewhat confident range of how we feel about executing our movies, and hopefully just kind of can give some insight into um, how the process works, how you should be thinking about your storytelling and your documentary filmmaking, and hopefully there's a little bit there for everyone. So thank you all for joining. And again, really hope that it's something fun that, helps you along your way. So I'm going to throw up some slides here because I like slides and they help me remember what I'm talking about. And they give you something to look at that isn't just my face and the wall behind me. And so, yeah, let me see. I will talk a little bit about myself. Sorry, this whole script thing is in the way. Um, a little bit about me. Angela kind of kicked it off with my like formal bio, and I just wanted to give kind of a little bit of insight into my background in production and some of the documentary work that I've done. So I've been a filmmaker for a little over 15 years. I went to graduate school in Chicago at DePaul University. Very kind of heavily production focused. As Angela kind of alluded to in my bio, a lot of my background is in narrative filmmaking, but documentary has always kind of been there alongside of it. Whether it's short documentaries throughout school, kind of like bigger, more commercial documentaries as I got started as a freelancer, and then on into some of the bigger documentary projects that I've been a part of. So I run a production company called Digital Hydra. We are also, just about 15 years old. I started that kind of fresh out of graduate school with some of the folks that I was in school with in and around Chicago. We got our start in both kind of commercial, corporate, and documentary work, and then kind of built up from there into some of the other kind of narrative fictional storytelling. So that was kind of the jumping off point. I've done kind of docu-series for international markets. My company, wrote, produced, and directed two or possibly three full seasons of a docu-series for the Middle East about health and wellness. Actually traveled to Saudi Arabia to film a documentary over there about doctors and medical students over there. Done plenty of stuff back home in Chicago. Angela mentioned the film Mr. Abbott that I was just last weekend was Halloween, whenever Halloween was, Halloween weekend. I was at the Chicago Emmys nominated for Outstanding Documentary Achievement in Historical Documentary. Said documentary too many times there. But anyway, like I said, documentary is, it wasn't my main thing starting out, but I really love to tell stories. Like that's what drew me into filmmaking in the first place. And hopefully it's something that all of you out there are kind of drawn to as well. And, there's the phrase that kind of goes around, the truth is stranger than fiction, right? Maybe some of us have heard that. And I think that is where things like documentary, unscripted is a word that people like to use kind of in TV and the industry now. I think that's where like the popularity behind a lot of those things come from, because like the things that we do as regular people are dynamic, dramatic, compelling, bizarre, interesting in ways that, like the greatest fictional mind could not even conceive, right? Human beings are kind of infinitely complex, and I think documenting the human experience and documenting our world yields some really amazing kind of stories to go along with it. So I'm just drawn to great stories, and let's kind of talk about that, right? The thing that I wanted to lead off with is kind of this question, what makes for a good story? If I could see you and I was talking to you, I'd probably let some people answer that question. But I'm kind of talking into the void, so I've got a few answers that really kind of resonate with me, and I think the things that make a story great really kind of transcend form, meaning that like whether you're talking about a fictional narrative story or something that happened in real life, the things that draw us into a good story, there's some universal qualities to that. And I think what we are kind of looking at as filmmakers and storytellers, right, are really a few things. The first one is going to be like a fresh perspective, a unique perspective. One of the things that I'm big on in my teaching, and hopefully, can help you all along with here tonight, is the idea of like your voice, right? What is your creative voice? What do you want to say, and how do you want to say it? Those are the things that really differentiate you in the world of storytellers, right? The world of content creators, if you want to use that word, because there's already a lot of people who are really good at telling stories, and so the story that you are able to tell and the way that you're able to tell it, right, becomes um, not just like your calling card, but really kind of your currency from you know making people pay attention to what you want to do and what you want to say. So that's kind of a big thing that sometimes it's just kind of born out of us. Sometimes if we're drawn to telling stories, it's just kind of something that emerges over time. The next thing is conflict. Right? There's a phrase in screenwriting, which is conflict is drama. The same thing really applies, I think, for our kind of honest, truthful human documentary stories, even historical ones. And it's maybe not conflict like the superhero punching a bad guy or something like that, but there are different conflicts inside of people, conflicted times throughout history. History is a big focus, obviously, of what this contest is about, right? And the challenges that people meet and that they rise to, the challenges within themselves, um, and how that kind of puts pressure on a person or a situation, right? Those things are compelling. We are drawn to stories of conflict because conflict is it's the impetus or the driving force of change, right? Conflict breeds change, and change is fundamentally what most stories are about. But the one that I put up in bold there is compelling characters. I think that's a good through line for what we're talking about here today, right? Documenting history. Um, there's certainly um, subjects, right, that you could build a whole documentary around, a huge whole story around, right? Maybe some kind of scientific advancement, some kind of very unique philosophical change in history or society. But I think ultimately for me, what people are drawn to are other human beings, right? I talked a lot about human beings being complex a minute ago. Like those are the things that draw us in, and that can be the actual human beings that appear on screen, on camera, right? This the person being interviewed, or if you're following someone around who's really dynamic and really interesting or bizarre and leads a weird life. Characters can be compelling in that way. Sometimes they are people that like we can't talk to anymore, right? The documentary film that I just did, Mr. Abbott, is about a man who's been dead since, excuse me, 1940. So it was a little bit difficult to lock him down for an interview, but he's a person who when brought to life through other conversations, through things like animation, which we used in that particular film, um, all of a sudden he's kind of a lost figure who is interesting and compelling and conflicted in his own right. And so for me, I think those are things to start to focus in on. But as you build out the stories that you want to tell, I really like leaning into that character one, because I think it's going to be the thing that kind of proves out your thesis of your story, which I'll talk a little bit about here in a second. And like I said, just kind of brings that humanity to the film, which is really what people are looking for and what they connect to. Um, so as kind of getting a vibe with hopefully here, what I'm going to do a little bit today is I'll talk a little bit about process, but I'm also going to talk kind of a lot about philosophy, like how you should be viewing your work, right? I'll talk about the steps of making a film, which some of us probably know and others maybe less so. and some of those things. But like those are kind of things that, one, we can't cover in a 45-minute to 1 hour evening together, but two, you can kind of learn on your own through various means, YouTube and whatnot, right? But I think what sets documentary a little bit apart from fiction, although you could make arguments for fiction, is this idea of truth, right, and reality. And obviously, truth is different in the eyes of different people, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But that's ultimately, I think, the core aspect of this particular filmmaking form. And your job as the documentarian, right, is to expose or reveal that truth, right? Reveal that truth in a compelling way, right? The truth well told is the way that I would like to frame it. And what does that mean, right? That means tell a good story, tell a story in a way that brings the subject to life, whether it's a time period, a person, whatever that is. Right? Like we are using a multimedia format, right? A multi-sensory format, picture plus audio, right? To create like unique experiences that can't be chronicled by just writing something down or just verbally telling somebody a story, right? The idea of cinematic storytelling, telling stories for the screen, whether it's a little bitty iPhone screen or a gigantic theater screen. We're choosing that form for a reason, right? We're choosing that format for a reason. So as documentarians, right, our job is to kind of meet the opportunities of that form and maximize the opportunities of that form. And so what that means to me, right, and where we'll kind of get into this, script, storyboard, screen of the kind of title of the course, or sorry, it's not a course, it's a workshop, is finding the best story and taking the time to do so, right? Documentary filmmaking is a very like patient endeavor. Sorry, I'm from Chicago, and I put up these Michael Jordan pictures from his documentary. But it's a really patient endeavor, which for me as a filmmaker was and kind of still is very challenging. It's one of the biggest challenges of it for me, because particularly as a younger person, when I was kind of closer to some of the ages of you all in here, right, I was an impatient person. Like I want to, like, let's get it done, let's tell the story, right? And kind of no matter the type of documentary, like it is an extended process, and that can mean a couple different things, right? So for example, the film that I've been talking about, Mr. Abbott, is a 25-minute movie. It took us close to 3 years to complete the 25-minute movie, right? That's a long time. That's longer than it's taken me to complete some fictional films that are almost 2 hours. I have a friend who's a director who worked on a documentary about, it's called How to Build a School in Haiti. He worked on that film for 10 years, right? Back and forth from various places in the US to Haiti, for 10 years before getting to the final product. And even if you're talking about things that might be like a specific moment in time, right? Say you're following, I don't know, a group of Olympians or a band on tour or something like that, right? A particular event, as it unfolds, right? It may not be as lengthy in terms of like the years that you're working on it, but what it is going to be is kind of lengthy and expansive in the amount of time you're spending with that subject, right? You're going to be following people around for days, weeks, hours upon end, that kind of thing. And so it's just a demanding form in terms of your patience and your dedication. And a lot of that comes from this process, right? And what I mean by that is, like, in this particular format, right, the story is ever evolving, right? The script is, unlike fictional storytelling, where, excuse me, we write the script and we go make the movie, right? Here's the plan, let's go do it, and we figure out how to execute it. And there are certainly challenges that come with that, but that thing is fixed. That story is agreed upon, and we are going out to try to figure it out, right? In documentary, sometimes there's not a script at all. Um, that script is going to change with every single person you talk to, every single step of the process. But again, if you're chronicling something in real time, that's going to, the story is going to change in real time. And so, again, back to that idea of patience, right? It's being patient with something that you don't have, total control over, at least not until you get to like your edit, and that kind of thing. Um, and so it really kind of just takes a different, type of attention. And so, like I said, there's a process, there's steps to it. Some of us might be familiar with that. I'll walk through those steps while, again, hopefully kind of bringing us back to, some of this kind of core philosophy, right? Like just ways to frame your creative thinking as a filmmaker that's hopefully useful to everybody. And so the first one, and the one that's, fairly unique to documentary, at least in terms of its level of importance, is research, right? Like documentaries at the end of the day, like, yes, it's about truth. Um, yes, it's about emotional cinematic storytelling, but they are informational, for the most part. And not in a way that's meant to be like, just something boring like reading out of an encyclopedia, right? The reason you make a film is to kind of avoid all that, right? But there is kind of a great deal of knowledge that is required to be a documentary filmmaker, right? You need to become an expert in your subject matter. And so how do you go about that, right? Well, you start with, whatever it is you want to tackle, and really, you tackle it very much like you would like a paper in school or something like that. You go on the web, you go, do we call it the web? I don't know anymore. I don't know. You go on the internet. You go to the library, right? You start talking to people who know about it, right? Writing is kind of going to be in the backdrop of everything I talk about here, process wise, because of that evolving story. Um, you are writing throughout the process, right? You might start with an idea about, whomever or whatever you're talking about, and just like I said, that's always changing as you go shoot. Well, it's probably changing as you read and learn things. um you're kind of getting new material and making notes on all of it as you go. So it's going to be a fairly exhaustive process to train yourself as the expert. um the level of expertise will vary depending on your subject matter and the length of your film. So like if you're doing a 5 minute thing, like, I don't know, you probably don't have to know everything about something that you might have to if you're doing a 5 hour miniseries, right? Or something like that. Um, it is common to hire researchers or a research team. Again, for my historical doc, that was something I did. For the other docs, a little bit less so. But just there was like a lot of kind of history to unearth about this man. Um, and I couldn't tackle it all by myself. And so I kind of had a team that could kind of make heads or tails of the things that existed in archives, and then I was able to take that, digest it, use their notes to get through in an organized fashion and kind of build out the story, that I was hoping to create. Again, throughout this process, we're writing the whole time. So things that we want to consider, right, on a philosophical level, right? You want to be objective in your research, right? You want to be comprehensive in your research, whatever that topic is, right? Like I'll get to this in a little bit, but like, most documentaries, I wouldn't say all because everything's different, right? Like most documentaries are not about like objectivity. They're not about, quote unquote, both sides. There's something that the filmmakers want to say. Um, but in kind of building that, argument, largely that your film kind of becomes, right? You need to make sure that you understand the sum total of all of those things, right? And so That's going to be a big thing. And even if your goal is to be more journalistic, right, more objective, like simply observe and report, right, then just diversity of sources is going to be really good, right? It's just kind of key to what's going on there, right? So gathering as much information as possible. Um, some other tips, in terms of how to kind of attack the research portion, right? Dig as deep as you can, look, in the unusual places, right? Like the first 5 lines of the Google search is not enough for, you to research an entire film. You have to go kind of find other things, right? That's why I said, physical analog spaces like libraries, things like that. Talking to people, having the people that you interview about one part of a subject recommend other people to talk to, right? Just like trying to go as far down the rabbit hole as possible, not only for that objectivity, but also for kind of the um, the goal of finding the most interesting stuff, right? Like, everyone can look at the Wikipedia of a thing and learn the kind of top level surface stuff about it. But if that's all you're doing, then what's the point of making a film about it? Unless it's super visual or cool or whatever. But again, you as the expert, right? Like you want to be able to tell the things that no one else can. That's kind of the goal that you have. So digging deep, organization becomes key, right? Hopefully you are all super organized people, and keep things nice and neat and tidy. But, as you get more and more sources, right? You've got a stack of newspapers over here. You've got recordings of interviews from 5 people over there. You've got articles from the web in one spot, right? Like you need a means to kind of sift through that stuff, or how I tend to approach things is like, I've probably got an outline or at least a kind of rough outline of things while I'm researching. We'll talk about formal outlines in a sec. Um, and so what I'm probably doing is kind of like assigning bits of my research to different kind of parts of that outline or different portions of the story that, I want to play with, right? Here's where I think the story is going to go. Oh, here's something that supports it. Here's something that contradicts it. Right? Like, I'm constantly kind of trying to figure out, like, again, here's my goal, but what is this thing evolving into as I move along? So that kind of takes us to writing, right? Which hopefully is kind of, self-explanatory what that is. We're going to write out the idea. And like I said, for me, this is going to start with outlines. Outline, I think, is really important in doc because it is a little bit harder to script for many things, not all things, but most things. You could certainly do a doc where it's just you doing voiceover and kind of got a bunch of found footage and you control everything. And then you could very easily write a script. But if you're doing something where you are talking to people, right, you're compiling stuff from a bunch of different sources, like I said, that's going to be, an ever evolving organism. So I'm going to start with an outline, right? And then I'm going to kind of build onto that, right? What is an outline? Hopefully we kind of know. Hopefully we've written a paper or two, even if we're 14. But what I'm trying to do there is kind of create the structure of my story, right? So at the top, I talked about this idea of voice, right? What do you want to say? How do you want to say it? And so with my film, with each film, there's going to be something that I'm, kind of getting at, right? Otherwise, why am I making the film? And so if it is a more kind of specific message, right, you're almost going to build your story like an argument. So if I want to get people to, let's say, I don't know, I'm telling a story about a couple and documenting their real life, right? And the place I want to end up is love conquers all, let's say, very nice, happy, friendly kind of thing, right? Well, then in my outline, right, I'm going to kind of build interesting pieces that take me step by step, um, you know, to ultimately prove out that thesis, right? And at the top of my film, at the top of my script, outline whatever it is, like that may be in the form of a question, right? I may kind of do like a reversal where it's like at the beginning of the film, like I'm, looking at like maybe love does not conquer all, right? Something like that. And then I'm kind of layering the steps to prove that out. Again, kind of just like a paper, right? How does a paper work? You or an essay rather. You start with that argument, you start with a thesis, this is what I think, and then I do however many paragraphs to prove that thing, right? The story that, you know, that you're building out on screen is largely going to be kind of in that similar vein, right? So that's going to start pretty broad, probably with bullet points, something like that. But as you learn more through the research, as you know, go into production, which we'll hit here in a second, right? You're going to start to fill in those details. You know, getting back to the kind of most recent film that I did, what I had was kind of like these, you know, the story spans like the 1800s up to like 1940, and we were doing a short version of an entire person's life. And so I kind of had bulleted out like, okay, here's the time periods that, you know, let's say it was like 5, you know, time periods or something like that, that I wanted to take us through. And then, you know, like I said earlier, kind of built out those sections as I went along. Okay, a little more on the writing side, right? Script. Like I said, this can be different for every single person here. For some of you, it may not exist at all. For some of you, there might be like portions that are scripted. Like you've got your kind of voiceover stuff scripted. You've got some of the imagery kind of mapped out. But you know, for other people, it might be like, I don't know, I got to go conduct these interviews and see what happens and see what people say to me, and then I bring that back and I'm writing a script, right? So again, where it starts to kind of differentiate itself from fictional stuff, it's like on a fiction, we're going to have that script on day one and go off and produce that, right? In documentary, we are writing all the way through to the post-production or the editing process, right? You are writing all the way through, rewriting sections, you know, figuring out new, not just story beats, but specific lines of dialogue, that kind of thing, right? But as you kind of step out of that outline, right, things we want to think about are like, what are we seeing on screen? A-roll and B-roll are terms I'll introduce here in a second. If there is voiceover and you know that it's going to be in there, you know, can you start, you know, getting specific with that kind of stuff? You know, where do you want it to end up? Those are really good things to be thinking about. So now we're kind of out of the script, right, and into this storyboard section of the stuff that we're looking at. And so just like with, you know, kind of some limitations to script, right? There's only a handful or a certain amount or certain limitation to the things that we can script. There's going to be some limitations to what you can storyboard, right? You can totally storyboard your interviews. My last film had a lot of art and kind of animation to it, so you could easily storyboard those kind of things, reenactments, B-roll shoots. The things that are a little bit more challenging is if there are, you know, real life, real time events going on, you know, say, I don't know, hey, I'm going to this protest and I'm going to film it and that's going to be part of my documentary. Like, you don't know what's going to be where, right? Like, you don't know who's going to be where, you don't know what's going to happen. So in those cases, right, the things that you want to kind of do to visualize is you want to figure out like your visual style, right? You know, is the camera work handheld, right? Is it, you know, all on a tripod? Are the shots, you know, kind of really close up or super zoomed in, right? You kind of want to create stylistic rules for your approach so that when you do kind of go out to those things you don't have control of, right, you're capturing them in a way that is visually consistent with all the stuff that you can control. Right. And documentary is a really forgiving form. What I mean by that is, you know, audiences are kind of used to mixed media just because, again, it's quote unquote real life. So you might have really beautiful B-roll shots, but then some of the stuff is, you know, somebody's crappy iPhone video that they, you know, had to record or something like that, because that's the only way that it could be documented. So it's a little more kind of open and fluid than narrative stories, but you know, ultimately, depending on you as a filmmaker, right, there's probably some degree of like control of the experience that you want. Once you got your script, you can move to pre-production. I'll kind of go through this one fairly quickly, right? That's budgeting and scheduling. If you are doing interviews with people, it's good to conduct like kind of like pre-interviews where you kind of figure out like, okay, you know, who is this person? You know, so like I might jump on Zoom with a person, a subject, an expert, before we go out and do the filming, to just figure out like, okay, what's their expertise? What do they really know? Are there other questions that I need to pivot to when I kind of talk to them? You can start doing what we'd call archival work, right? Which is going out and finding different stock footage or existing things, setting up your B-roll, that kind of thing, right? Big kind of picture tips here is like in pre-pro, you want to over prepare, right? You want to be really detailed with your scheduling. You want to leave pockets of money, whether you have $5 to make a movie or 500,000, right? You want to create pockets of money for the kind of inevitable hiccups and things like that will eventually show up. In terms of scheduling, right? Scheduling more than just like your initial days, leaving space, whether that's money or time, to do things like reshoots and things like that. It's all kind of really good practice to make sure everything goes fantastic. Then we get into production, right? We've set everything up, we made our schedule, we have a good plan to go out, and we go out and do it. And so, again, that could be conducting interviews with people. A lot of times that's going to be it, right? Other times, if you're more what we call like verite documentary, which means you're like observing what's going on, it's just going to be you going around and following the subject, right? Following the person, observing nature, like this wonderful bearded man in the photo. There's kind of two like categories of your visual kind of capture, right? And those are called A-roll and B-roll. So A-roll is your main stuff, your interviews, your stuff with your subject, etc. B-roll is going to be visual things that go over the top of that, right? So if I'm talking about, my apartment growing up or something like that, there's shots of the building or something like that that kind of go over what I'm talking about. Again, things to consider from a more kind of core, it's not a creative, but like philosophical standpoint. When it comes to camera, right? Camera and sound. A question I get a ton from students is like, what's the best camera, right? It's not, there is no best camera. It's like, what's the best camera for the job, right? The camera and lenses you need to capture nature photography are probably going to be slightly different than the ones you need for, I don't know, war photography or something like that, or sit down interviews and whatnot. You need to figure out things like, what am I looking at? How close can I get to the person or the subject or whatever that is? How much runtime do I need on my media and my memory cards and all those things, right? Am I able to change my lens? For some of us who are teenagers right now and not like film students, that's stuff that will kind of come a little bit later down the line. But there's always kind of this kind of give and take of like, what are like the logistical needs of what I'm doing, and then what are my kind of creative goals. Getting good sound is really, really important. Again, people will be forgiving of some things, right, in terms of sound, but like, especially for like your interviews, your voiceover, that kind of thing. We need to be able to hear it, right? This is informational. We need to be able to hear it, and we need to be able to hear it clean. Most of you are at an age where even if you're not like technically students, like you're kind of in that student film sphere. And what I always say to student filmmakers is like, you want to take away reasons for people to say like, oh, that's just a student film, or it was good for a student film, right? You want people to take your story seriously, and for your story to be taken seriously, it needs to look good and it needs to sound good. It's not stuff I can teach you right here on a Zoom where you can't even talk to me, but it's something that you kind of want to pursue, right? And so the overall goal though of your production is go out and get what you need to tell the story. And that hopefully sets us up for more writing. It hopefully sets us up for our editing and our editorial. So like I said, you are writing throughout production in most of the documentary cases, right? And back to that idea of patience, back to that idea of dedication, finding the best story, right? Like that means being kind of open to seeing where new things go. Maybe you thought you were following, I don't know, the dad of this family, right? But it turns out that like the teenage daughter is way more interesting and goes off and has an adventure. And it's like, we probably should go over here and tell that story, right? I don't know, hypotheticals. But just kind of being actively writing based on the things that you learn and the things that you experience, like that's kind of the gig and the job, again, truth well told, bringing it back to that. Just kind of a couple other things, and we'll throw it open for some questions, right? Post-production process, this is our editing, right? So actually assembling all the stuff, right? If you've done your job in production, you've got all the raw material that you need to come into the edit and assemble the movie. Now, the kind of big challenge here is, particularly with documentary, since there's so many ways that you can slice, is like, okay, I'm trying to tell this story, like how do I go about it? Like which, do I put the interview with Patrick at the beginning or at the end or in the middle? Do I chop it up into 3 spots and he comes and goes, right? How should this all kind of lay out? And ultimately you want to go back to like those core questions, right? First one is, what do you want to say? But then I hit that, how do you want to say it? And sometimes that's about your style, but sometimes it's also about like, how do I want the audience to experience something, right? Maybe I don't want to give all of a person's story at the very beginning because I'm building to like a more dramatic reveal, right? Or a turn or something like that. Maybe I want to misdirect and make people think that, something horrible happens and the, love conquers all couple that I've been following is going to break up, but actually, in the climax, and they get back together and it's really wonderful, and now everybody's crying and it's fantastic. So this idea of sequencing information, right? How do we arrange the information in a way that it maximizes the emotional impact, or at the very least just has the impact that we want it to have. We're kind of closer on time, so there's a link that I'll share these slides with Angela and the team, and they can share this stuff out with you. But it talks about this kind of editing theory, which is called montage theory. Any of you who are in film school probably experienced this, right? And what this is about is how the arrangement of shots and the arrangement of information in terms of documentary changes changes the meaning of what we're looking at. But I want to kind of make sure that we get through some of these things and get to talk a little bit at the end, or at least answer the Q&A questions, right? So, we go in, we do our edit. Again, that's kind of the biggest rewrite, the final rewrite stage in a way, right? The place where you're going to have the most control over the story. All of that stuff that I said at the beginning about like, hey, you don't get to write a script. Well, in the edit, you get to write everything, right? You get to decide what goes in, what's pulled out, right? How much of, somebody talking, or how are you going to editorialize through your voiceover, all of those pieces, right? Once that's done, you'll go to things like post-production sound, cleaning up the sound, mixing it, color correction, finishing, which is getting the movie ready to exhibit. And for most of us doing this contest, especially if we're kind of new to this stuff, like that's just going to be you at your computer using whatever editing software you have, making sure it looks and sounds the best that it can, and exporting a video. But as you grow, right, those of us who kind of go on to do this in bigger and bigger ways, it becomes a little bit more complex. You're getting it ready for theaters, TV stations, that kind of thing. So the last kind of thing I wanted to close out with before opening it up for questions is this idea of like, when is it done, right? Okay, we're especially for doc, right, and fiction as well, like we reach this place where we've got all of these options, right? We've got all of these choices, and there's always like, oh, I could get one more shot of the statue of Abraham Lincoln to make sure that my movie works better, or I really should go talk to this person who I couldn't get a hold of at this time, right? Like any kind of work of creation, work of art, like it can almost be an endless process if you really want it to, right? But at a certain point, you kind of need to declare it to be done. And in my humblest of opinions, right? there's the phrase that I'm about to butcher, which is like perfection is the enemy of productivity or something like that, right? Perfection can get in the way of us finishing things. And I'm of the opinion that you as filmmakers don't want to be that. If you can finish your films, you will find yourself out further and more successful than at least half of the people who want to do this, because people just can't seem to finish stuff. But we still need to kind of figure out how to answer this question. And I'm going to answer it with, kind of an obtuse, subjective, philosophical answer, which is it's done when the truth is well told, right? It's done when you have found that truth, when it's been told in the way that you want, and you've built it in the compelling way that really kind of makes sense to you and you hope will resonate with your audience. And then from there, it's kind of up to them how they respond. So we'll throw it over to some questions in a second. I did have this one slide here about just kind of resources for those of us who are interested in this kind of thing, right? Looking up grants and workshops, much similar to what we're doing here. There are lots of grants for young filmmakers, for documentary filmmakers, for people making films about very specific things. YouTube is a vast and infinite resource that can teach you all about production. I use it to augment most of my teaching. But really, I would encourage you to keep doing things like this and making films with your phone or whatever you can get your hands on. Again, if you're in film school and can get some gear, that's great. But just make things. Like, that's how you become a better storyteller. I will stop sharing. And Angela, I don't know if you want to jump back on or if you want me to just come on here to do these
Well,
Q&A ones.
we have a couple from Pam,
Okay,
and she is asking about iPhone footage.
sure.
And she said, I like shooting with my iPhone 16 Pro Max because it's less intrusive than the equipment that a full crew would be using. So she also mentioned that you refer to crappy iPhone footage, and
Sure, sure,
can
sure.
you say more about that? So
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely I can expand on those things. I mean, I would
okay.
say, inherently most of our kind of more recent iPhones, definitely 16 included, are not crappy. Without going too far into it, like we're in a really amazing time where I have like a movie studio in my pocket, right? I can shoot a movie, I can edit a movie, and I can distribute a movie all from the device that I carry around with me. That's phenomenal. Most of our phones shoot in 4K resolution, which is very high resolution. Um, the limitations are not going to be about the quality of footage. It's going to be more about like not being able to change lenses and shot sizes and that kind of thing. Audio is a thing that you have to solve. So I think, Pam, what you're working with is probably totally fine. But as if you keep working with this stuff, you'll probably start to encounter some of the limitations of like what you creatively want to do and what the phone offers. But anything really like iPhone like 14. I have somewhere here like a iPhone 12 or some miserable piece of thing because I don't want to upgrade it. But anything like in the last several years is going to be totally fine. All right, Seth, how are you storing? That's a really great question. So how I could frame that quickly, Seth, is you should have a portable hard drive that is dedicated specifically to that project, and then you should have a backup of that hard drive. That's kind of thing number one. Depending on the size of your movie, that should be anything between 1 terabyte and like 4 terabytes. Could be more if you're doing like a big feature or docu-series, right? But we'll just kind of talk about more reasonably sized things. From there, you talk about labeling, right? Labeling and organization is essential in any filmmaking process, particularly this one. And so, how that usually is going to be organized is it'll start by, when it's stored, it's usually by like day, right? So shooting day, if you're shooting for 5 days, it's like, okay, here's, day one, memory card number one. What you can also do to make it a little bit more clean is kind of organize it by kind of subject. So, you know, if you're interviewing Angela, it would be like Angela interview, card number one, card number two. Patrick interview, card number one, card number two. You know, B-roll out in, you know, the country, the city, whatever that's going to be, right? And then from there, we're kind of separating that stuff out because you're right. There's a lot that kind of goes into it. And also, um, you know, what you want to be able to do is like hand off the drive to an editor and they're able to make heads or tails of it without, you know, you telling them where everything is or whatnot. So hopefully that kind of helped. All right, we got AJ and Omar. Hey, Omar. How do you about telling true has no bright side, line filming? I mean, that's a really great question, AJ. You know, there's not, I don't have like a, you know, binary answer to that question. Like everyone's kind of comfortability and kind of ethics around that thing are going to vary. What I would say in terms of being exploitative is, I don't know, I kind of feel like, you know, if you're being exploitative, right? Like if you're telling an honest story and that story is depressing, or to Omar's question, like the subject makes themselves not look good, right? That's not necessarily on you, right? Like that you didn't, as long as you're not like, you know, doing the reality TV show producer thing and coercing them into bad behavior, right? Or something like that. You know, if you're just, if you're asking a question and the person chooses to answer it in a way that is um you know, incriminating or, you know, something to that nature, like I don't think you're in any kind of place of like violation. But you know, I think if you are recutting someone's interview in a way that makes them look bad that they didn't actually say it that way, that would certainly be a violation in my opinion. So like, I'm sorry I don't have like a, you know, 100% like straightforward answer. You know, you kind of talk about the idea of community there and not being part of a community that you know, like be living in a reality, right? That's a very real thing, right? People go into areas of poverty, war-torn areas, things like that, and tell their story. I think, you know, for me in instances like that, although I haven't done it so much on doc, but I think that's a place where that research becomes really, really important, right? Like actually talking to the people of that community, immersing yourself in that community, um, to where you kind of understand them as human beings and not as, you know, something else, characters in your film or whatever. I think that's going to be important. That's going to guide you to it. Um, and, you know, again, just hopefully approaching it from a place of, you know, what you kind of ethically think is appropriate, I guess would be the best way I could um, say it, right? Like that's kind of the thing, the way I'd frame it as best I could.
Um, I was wondering a little bit about Mr. Abbott. And so
Sure.
you talked about the thesis and it sometimes it changes along the way. So what was your original thesis for that story? And is it the same that you ended up with? And can you, and maybe a little bit why you chose that subject?
Sure. Um, so yeah, that one, like, so he's kind of, you know, the founder of one of the largest, or really the largest and most prominent Black newspaper in America, became one of the first kind of multimillionaires, African American multimillionaires in a time like the early 1900s where like there wasn't anybody like that. So he's kind of like this compelling, you know, lost figure. And so initially when we started to tell the story, one of the things that we wanted to kind of frame it around, which I think is there, but it wasn't like the core of it, was just like the power of the press and the power of media, right? And how, you know, telling our stories through media can not only lead to financial gain, which he did, but also can like reshape the world around us, right? So like a big thing that he did through his newspaper was he was the principal engineer of what's called like the Great Northern Migration, which is you know, 4 million Black families moving out of the South and into community like cities in the North. And so all of that is through words, right? Like that was really kind of a piece of it. But kind of as it evolved, right, it started to become a little bit about like the pages left out of history, and the this person who did this kind of significant thing being kind of lost to history, and like, so okay, like what is that? Sorry, we have like a few questions coming in. Pitch decks for my documentary, Seth. It depends, right? You make a pitch deck if you want to convince someone to give you money, right? You might be required to do one for a grant or a competition, or if you're trying to get people on board. I definitely did it for the Mr. Abbott film. To Omar's question, being a subject in your own documentary, I think we have plenty of examples of really like everything, right? Of both. I think if you're the subject of your documentary, it is probably going to be somewhat hard to be objective, a little bit. I wouldn't necessarily advise against it unless you have, some horrible secret that you don't want to get out into the world, and in which case, then maybe not. No, there was, I forget what the film was called. There was a film on HBO where, like, you know, I don't know, 30 years later, like through the production, this man like admitted to murdering someone and then ended up getting like arrested for it. The Jinx, I think that was called. Um, so, if you're hiding a murder, then don't do that. That's a joke. But it just kind of depends what it is, right? It's hard for me to give a kind of blanket answer to that question. I think what would be useful if you are the subject of your documentary and you are also like the director is at the very least having an editor who's kind of assembling it without you shaping everything, right, and kind of adjusting it in a way that's not as objective or whatever. But it really just depends on um, what you're doing. So I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know Tommy G. Omar. Um, what do we got here, Pam? But from a journalistic point, Omar, to finish out your question, I'll jump to Pam. I do think there's tons of things that do that. I mentioned the guy who did the documentary about Haiti. He's in the documentary and going around, and he's the voiceover. I did voiceover on my documentary, so I think that there's a lot of precedent for that. If like it's like not about you, but you're kind of a participant. That's like, I didn't go into like forms, but if you guys do a Google, there's like kind of like 6 forms of documentary that are out there. Some are like you are in it, other ones are more objective. So that's almost more of like a POV. But I think having yourself in there as kind of journalist or narrator can do some interesting things to open up like emotional kind of revelations about it and things like that, and discovery in a way that I think is really useful. Jumping over to Pam's, integrity is great. No problem. Um, Sorry, Pam. So could you clarify a little bit what you're saying there? And I will jump to Seth. So you're saying if like you have a different opinion than someone and you want to counter their position with integrity, or you just think that you need to cover the journalism in your area better than the newspaper is doing it. Seth, scheduling conflicts. So, uh, the easiest way to solve scheduling conflicts is like you're paying people, and hopefully you're paying people something, no matter what. Some people will be, especially if we're students or whatever, like some people will be kind of on board to just show up and do it. And some people are passionate about things and show up and do it. But you know, that's kind of the top level solve for that. If you are kind of piecing something together, like you just have no money and you're passionate about it and you're trying to like make it happen, I think then you just kind of have to be respectful of people's time. So the thing I would do to combat that, Seth, to your question, is like there's not just one camera operator. I've got like three or four, right? So I've got, you know, Angela who can come out on Tuesday, but she works on Wednesday and Thursday. So Kristen will come out on Wednesday and I'll do the camera on Thursday, right? Like it's just kind of wrapping your head around, kind of tackling those logistics.
Okay, well, I guess that's it. We've come to the end of the hour. Thank you so much, Patrick, for joining us for today's mentor session. And thank you for
Yeah,
everyone
no
who
problem.
tuned in and asked such great questions.
Do you want
And
me
I'm
to answer Pam's question, Angela, really fast?
did Pam, did she
She
clarify
she
that
she
one?
threw yeah she threw
Oh,
that
she
in
did. Oh,
there.
yeah. Okay.
How much do you need to represent the opposition? Again, it's going to be subjective. It's going to depend on what you're talking about. Like, let's say you were talking about a political issue. Pick your political issue. I will not pick a political issue, but like there, it's probably going to be important to at least get the opinions of both sides, right? Like, you can come in and editorialize. But after the fact, right? Like you can come in with your point of view, however you do that, voiceover or otherwise, and reflect on what's being said. But I think, again, whatever side of any story, not just political issue, um, you're shortchanging almost the viewer, right? With your withholding portions of the information. So I think you want to gather the information and then that hopefully will kind of evolve your thinking or your position as we go. Sorry, one of my headphones died, so if I sound weird, I apologize.
Not at all. We hope you'll all join us next Monday at the same time. We have our next session is the ethics of AI in documentary filmmaking, and that's with award-winning BET producer Chris Hastings and international documentary producer Louise Rosen, moderated by Jason Steinauer, founder of History Communications Institute. And it's about how filmmakers can balance creativity, historical accuracy, and accountability in the age of AI. So it should be pretty interesting. And then we are also developing a mentor session on ethical telling of Indigenous narratives with Jim Pepper Henry. So we'll provide more information about that as that gets scheduled. So there we go. Sorry. Okay. Okay, before you leave, please take a moment to complete the short survey that will pop up when you exit. Your feedback really helps us continue to improve our programming. Thanks again for being part of the latest Generation Film Contest community and have a wonderful evening. Thanks, everybody.
Bye,
Thanks again,
everybody.
Patrick.
No problem, Angela. Take care.
Take care.